So this talk is on what I call the curse of economic nationalism, and I'm going to explain this partly in economic theory, partly in some mostly American economic history, also. And I'm certainly no Murray Rothbard, but one of the Murray's lectures that I enjoyed the most, when he could stand up and just give him a topic, and and this is what attracted me to Austrian economics in the first place. And it was a big combination of economic theory, political philosophy, European history, American history, and that's what he looked at as being an economist, being an economic scholar, and I've tried to do maybe 1% of that in my career of being interdisciplinary like that. And so that's why my talks are a little different than just pure economic theory. But so where I'm going to start is one of the first speeches that Donald Trump gave on economics in 2017, in March of 2017. He went to Louisville, Kentucky, and because he wanted to quote Henry Clay, Congressman Henry Clay, and he made a speech on what Henry Clay's called the American system. And this was Trump's big economic nationalism speech. And whoever wrote it for him was a big fan of Henry Clay, and also Lincoln was sort of a political descendant of Henry Clay. And so it's relevant today. Even though I'm talking about history, this is relevant today. The President of the United States announced in 2017 that his economic program is going to be based on something called economic nationalism. And there can be different interpretations of this, but there's a unique American definition of economic nationalism. And I'm going to quote, and it started at the time of the American founding. And I'm going to quote Murray Rothbard from his book on history of money and banking as saying what was going on here. And so what was going on? I'm going way back now. I'm going to start with Alexander Hamilton and in the 1780s. And so, and after the American Revolution, Hamilton, who was George Washington's assistant in the Revolution, very precocious, but I think the scientific word would be butt kisser for Hamilton. But how Hamilton got to be, as 22 years old, George Washington's assistant in the Revolutionary War, and but anyway, he decided, well, I'm no longer going to work for George Washington, so I'd like to work for the richest man in America, so Robert Morris. So he writes Morris a letter, about basically applying for the job of Treasury Secretary. And at the same time, he wrote a letter to a senator, a future Senator, Timothy Pickering, who would be George Washington's Secretary of State and Secretary of War. And Pickering was known to know something about finance. He was a finance guy, and a senator from Massachusetts eventually. And so Pickering sent him some pamphlets, some sort of British mercantilist pamphlets about protectionism and a few other things. And that was the extent of Alexander Hamilton's economic education, these mercantilist pamphlets. But they were enough for him to be able to compose a letter to Robert Morris saying, I agree with you that we need protectionist tariffs. We need a bank modeled after the Bank of England, and we need subsidies for the road building corporations and things, so that you, Mr. Morris, the richest man in America, Robert Morris, can get your goods to market. Okay, and so like I said, he was a very good butt kisser, and it worked. So Robert Morris contacts George Washington and recommends Hamilton to be Treasury Secretary. And according to Ron Chernow, the big Pulitzer Prize winning biographer of Hamilton, George Washington turned to Hamilton and said, I didn't know you knew anything about finance. We never talked about it. But if Mr. Morris wants you to be the Treasury Secretary, you've got the job. So that's how I got the job. Okay, I think that's the facial mask police coming into town, coming into Auburn there. So, and here's what Murray said about it, Murray Rothbard. He said what they're up to. So you have this cabal of Morris and the New York, Philadelphia, Boston big business of the day, whatever big business was, cartel of the day. And they were using Hamilton as their emissary, as he was their man in the government. And Murray said this, What they wanted was, quote, to reimpose in the new United States a system of mercantilism and big government similar to that of Great Britain, against which the colonists had rebelled. The object was to have a strong central government, particularly a strong president or king as chief executive, built up by high taxes and heavy public debt. The strong government was to impose high tariffs to subsidize domestic manufacturers, develop a big navy to open up and subsidize foreign markets for American exports. Open up at gunpoint, I assume that means, well, what else would you need a navy? You're not going to persuade people to buy your wheat. You're going to aim a cannon at them to buy your wheat. For American exports, and launch a massive system of internal public works, which means government subsidized road and canal building at the time. In short, the United States was to have a British system without Great Britain, end quote. That's Murray Rothbard. Another part of the plan, Rothbard said, was, quote, to organize and head a central bank to provide cheap credit and expanded money for himself, Morris, and his allies with the help of his youthful disciple, Alexander Hamilton. So Murray called Hamilton Morris's youthful disciple. And so that was the birth of what's called economic nationalism, which has always been a synonym for mercantilism, British mercantilism, which is basically a collection of policies that benefits political policies that benefits producers at the expense of consumers and everybody else. That's sort of a short one-line definition that Murray Rothbard gave in one of his publications, actually. Okay, and so what was the result of this? I'm going to talk about some of the results of this, of what happened, the development of economic nationalism and the opponents of it, and why I call it a curse. In fact, I called my book on Hamilton's Curse, because there was a book that was sort of annoying to me by John Steele Gordon called Hamilton's Blessing. It was about public debt being a blessing. So I thought, I just didn't like that. So I wrote a whole book trashing the whole idea of Hamilton's blessing as far as that goes. So but I'm going to start with the public debt. Here's stark contrast in thinking about public debt and borrowing. And this, by the way, the view of Hamilton and people and his supporters on the public debt was pure mercantilism. It was certainly early Keynesianism, really, sort of the glorification of government borrowing. And here's a quote from Hamilton: "A national debt, if it is not excessive, will be to us a public blessing." That's where Hamilton's blessing comes from, a national debt. Of course, Hamilton himself spent the rest of his life trying to explode the public debt as much as possible, even though he said for public consumption, if it's not too excessive. But he did everything he could when he was Treasury Secretary to make sure that public debt was excessive as possible. And I'll read a quote about that later. Compare that to Jefferson. I had a Jefferson quote on the same topic. Now, Jefferson's position on public debt was that it's legitimate for the government to borrow money, but it should never be more than a 20-year bond, because that was a generation. Generation in those days, 20 years. So he said it was immoral for one generation to impose a debt burden on the future generation. And that view prevailed in America. It was a very powerful view, basically until World War I. With ups and downs. There were, ups and downs in debt, but Andrew Jackson, for example, paid off the public debt. There was zero national debt when he was president. And here's what Jefferson said: "I consider the fortunes of our republic as depending in an eminent degree on the extinguishment of the public debt." So you couldn't be more different than Hamilton. Hamilton sees it's a blessing to have more public debt. And here's Jefferson saying, no, the blessing is if we get rid of the public debt. And that sort of set the template of the debate for generations in America anyway. And of course, a lot of other countries follow suit to what goes on in America in history. Not always, but a lot of times. Okay. And so Hamilton's first caper, the reason why he thought the public debt was a blessing was that he thought the Constitution was far too restrictive of government, and he wanted government to be more or less unlimited as long as it was run by wise people like himself. And so he was constantly complaining to George Washington that the government was too small. And so he was quite Machiavellian. His plan was to associate the wealthiest people in the country who would own the public debt. That's who would buy the government bonds. and therefore they would become a powerful lobbying force for higher taxes of the government, because they would want to make sure there was always enough revenue in the Treasury to pay off the principal and interest on their bonds, on their government bonds. So he's very Machiavellian about it, and that's the reason he gave. He came right out and said it. That's the reason. It's not like this was some sort of secret conspiracy between him and Morris. He was right. He came out and said it. I guess politicians weren't always as clever liars as they are today. They sometimes just let it slip like that, which he did. And so one of the capers that they pulled to achieve this was the war debt, the Revolutionary War debt issued by the states. A lot of the old veterans were given bonds instead of money as payment for being in the army. And so they were holding on to these bonds that at the time were trading between 2 and 10% of par value. And so the government in Washington, the government had passed a law saying that they were going to buy up these bonds at 100% of par value. But only the insiders in the government knew this. But the farmers and the rednecks in North Carolina and the veterans, they didn't know this. And this was for all the young people in the audience. This was before the internet, so you couldn't easily find this out. So there was a huge arbitrage opportunity here, wasn't it? You could buy up these bonds that are on the market selling at 2% of par value, you knowing that you could turn around in a couple of months and get 100% par value for the same bond. And so there was this mass exodus all up and down the eastern seaboard of ships, wagon trains, coaches, stagecoaches, horseback, of emissaries of the politically connected to buy up as many of these bonds as possible from the hapless and unknowing Revolutionary War veterans and others who held these bonds, who were glad to say, it's trading at 2%, I'll give you 10%. Who wouldn't take that deal? Not knowing that it was going to be worth 100% in value in a couple of months. And so that was one thing that happened, and this convinced Hamilton or Jefferson that what these people wanted was what he called consolidation bottomed on corruption. That is, consolidation. Their real goal was a consolidated, monopolistic, highly centralized government that could impose their economic agenda on the whole country: protectionism, corporate welfare for road building and canal building, and a national bank. Because they knew there was huge opposition to this. This is the British system. They just fought a revolution against this. This is not going to fly. You need coercive power to impose this. And that was always the ultimate objective. And so Jefferson very cleverly understood that what was going on. He smoked them out by understanding that, well, there were many members of Congress who became extremely wealthy. We're talking millions of dollars at the time, the equivalent of millions of dollars in the 1780s. And so, including Hamilton himself, made a bundle on this. And so Jefferson noted in one of his publications that this will tie these members of Congress to the Federalist Party forever. Whatever they want, I'll do, because they're making me rich. And so if they want me to vote for protectionist tariffs, a national bank, all this, I'm your man. Okay, and so that's what was going on there. And of course, this established, sort of the virtues of a public debt is what Hamilton was promoting, and the fiscal illusion that goes along with it. There's a sort of a public choice term, is that whenever government borrows money instead of taxing you to pay for the things that it's doing, it disguises the true cost of government somewhat, because it's able to, most people don't see it, until later. Okay, and so that's one of the things that's going on. And another thing that happens is that when a government imposes a debt like that, is that it tends to raise the rate of time preference. Hans Hoppe has written about this in quite a few places, that if people expect there's going to be higher taxes in the future to pay off their part of the debt, the public debt, the national debt, then it makes short-term investment, short-term consumption look more attractive. If I'm going to be an investor and invest in something, I'd rather invest when the government's going to take fewer taxes out of the profits of my investment now rather than in the future. And so it tends to increase the rate of time preference, which is a bad thing for the future of economic growth. And so I look at this debate early debate over that aspect of economic nationalism, the public debt, as it's mercantilism and it's sort of pre-Keynesianism too, isn't it? It's not the same argument that Keynes made by any stretch of the imagination about government borrowing, but it was an argument about the virtues of the blessings of national debt. Okay, and of course the other part of economic nationalism, and maybe this is why Trump likes the phrase economic nationalism. He just got the Fed to expand the money supply by what was it, $3 trillion for the latest boondoggle in Washington, was the Bank of the United States. The first central bank, national bank in the United States, was called the Bank of North America, and it was inflated its currency so much that within a year, people had no confidence at all in the currency, and it was privatized. And that was the work of Morris himself. Morris got his Bank of the United States to provide cheap credit for him and his business partners and associates, and that was a big bust. But they never gave up. They gave Hamilton the assignment of resurrecting a national bank, and so he lobbied George Washington for that. And Washington again asked Jefferson and Hamilton and a few others to write their opinions on a constitutionality of a national bank. And it was clearly unconstitutional because the American Constitutional Convention debated the issue and rejected it. And so, what more evidence do you need? And it's not in delegated powers in the Constitution of a bank. And so, you'd think case closed, but that's when Hamilton invented the idea of implied powers of the Constitution. He basically said, well, if you read between the lines, there's room for a bank run by politicians. Who wouldn't want a bank run by politicians? And put all the money in the hands of a bunch of politicians. Who would think that's a bad idea? And to make it a short story, what eventually happened is they had this debate, and George Washington at the time, they were about to move the national capital to Virginia and create Washington, D.C. And George Washington was a big land speculator, and he owned all this land in Virginia. And he told the Federalists in New England, who were the Hamilton's party, the Federalists, if you extend the border of Washington, D.C. to my property in Mount Vernon, I'll vote for the bank. And so that was the political deal that was done. And so George Washington, not vote, but sign off on the bank. So he signed the legislation. He didn't veto it. He signed the legislation. The Federalists had the vote. And we got the Bank of the United States, first national bank. And here's what Rothbard said about the effect of this. The Bank of the United States promptly fulfilled its inflationary potential by issuing millions of dollars in paper money and demand deposits, pyramiding on top of $2 million in specie. The bank invested heavily in loans to the United States government, in addition to $2 million invested in the assumption of pre-existing long-term debt assumed by the new federal government. The bank engaged in massive temporary lending to the government, which reached $6.2 million by 1796. The result of the outpouring of credit and paper money by the new Bank of the United States was an increase in prices of 72% from 1791 to 1796. So 72% price inflation in 5 years, in addition to the boom and bust cycles that it always creates. And it was given a 20-year charter, and it created so much inflation and boom and bust and corruption by, for example, financing one side of the political debate in America, that Congress did not recharter the Bank of the United States after the first 20 years. But then the War of 1812 came, and they decided they needed to monetize the war debt of the War of 1812. And so they created the Second Bank of the United States that came into being in 1817. Now, who here, you've been at Mises University for a couple days, who here recognizes the significance of the year 1819? in Austrian economics. You're too old. I'm not gonna. You've been around for like years. No, go ahead. Go ahead. I was one of the younger students. No, go ahead. Tell them what's.
It was the Panic of 1819.
Panic of 1819. Yeah, Murray Rothbard's doctoral dissertation, The Panic of 1819. And so my hunch is it's not just a coincidence that the Bank of the United States was resurrected in 1817. And then 1819 was the Panic of 1819, 2 years later. So the Bank of the United States did what the Bank of the United States does. It created the Panic of 1819. And as Murray wrote, for the first time in American history, there was massive unemployment in some of the cities. I think he gathered what statistics he could get. I think in Philadelphia, the number of jobs went from something like 9,500 jobs in small manufacturing, which was basically shops where people were, I don't know, manufacturing shoes or things like that. There was no electricity, so there wasn't mass production, from 9,500 to something like 2,500. So, the big, huge percentage drop off in employment in American cities from the panic. And by the way, that's back in those days, depressions, what we today call a depression, was called a panic. It was Herbert Hoover who came up with the idea that panic is a bad word. People might panic. Let's call it something nicer, like a depression. We'll call it a panic. So, he was a clever engineer, Herbert Hoover. So that created, and then Murray Rothbard also has high praise for the Jacksonians, not necessarily Jackson himself, but the Jacksonians. He considers them to be a legitimate libertarian party, the Jacksonians of the early 19th century in America. And every time I say this or write this somewhere in an article, or say anything positive about Andrew Jackson, like when he defunded the Second Bank of the United States, I get inundated with emails accusing me of defending everything he ever did in his entire life. I don't know where this kind of logic comes from, but anyway. But that's the way it is. So Murray praised not necessarily Jackson, but Jacksonians. The party, apparatus was very libertarian, and of course it starts with Jackson's vetoing of the Bank of the United States. So we had another 20 years of this boom and bust and political corruption. They literally paid retainers to Daniel Webster, the bank did, and other people to support the bank in the Senate. Okay, so just think about that. That's a pretty bold move there. And but Andrew Jackson was kind of schizophrenic, because as far as economic nationalism goes, it was Andrew Jackson who tried to enforce a big tariff increase from 12 or 13% to 48% in 1828. But at the same time, he vetoed the Bank of the United States. So he supported the protectionist tariff, but then he killed the Bank of the United States. But he was a supporter of the protectionism for a while also. But here's what he said when he vetoed the rechartering of the Bank of the United States. I'll read just a part of his statement. Andrew Jackson said, "It is to be regretted that the rich and powerful too often bend the axe of government to their selfish purposes. Distinctions in society will always exist under every just government. Equality of talents, of education, or wealth cannot be produced by human institutions, but every man is equally entitled to protection by law, rule of law. But when the laws undertake to add these natural and just advantages, artificial distinctions, to grant titles, gratuities, and exclusive privileges, to make the rich richer and the potent more powerful, the humble members of society who have neither the time nor the means of securing like favors to themselves, favors from government," remember, he's saying, "have a right to complain of the injustice of their government. If government would confine itself to equal protection, it would be an unqualified blessing. In the act before me, that is to recharter the Bank of the United States, there seems to be a wide and unnecessary departure from these just principles." So he pretty much condemned it as thoroughly corrupt and vetoed the rechartering, and the Bank of the United States eventually went out of business over the next several years as a result of that. And so that was one of the high points in American history. I think Andrew Jackson vetoing the rechartering of the Bank of the United States. Okay, Another thing that, another part of economic nationalism, protectionism, Hamilton, again, it's amazing how many bad ideas came from Hamilton. And I mentioned yesterday at our Q&A session that last week, the New York Post reporter called me on the phone because they had, she had seen my book on Hamilton. This is this book here. And they were doing a story on Alexander Hamilton, since I guess this Broadway musical is now going to be on television. So it makes it an issue, I guess. And she was writing an article on, would Hamilton be a Democrat or Republican? She wanted to know. That's a good question. I thought, on the one hand, he's sort of like a Pat Buchanan Republican on economics, which is, total nonsense, an economic doofus, on economics. And so I told her that he would probably be more like a Ted Kennedy Democrat, but not a crazy socialist Bernie Sanders Democrat. And they quoted that in the New York Post. They had that, and they provided a link to my book too. So I probably sold one or two books to that. But Hamilton. It was Hamilton who invented the infant industries argument for protectionism, that new industries need protection with tariffs and subsidies, or else they can't compete with the older British industries of the day, and so forth. And he had a lot of and that, of course, all industries are infants at some point. How did the British industries become so big and dominant? They were infants at some point. They didn't always all have protectionism and subsidies to grow up. You just ignore that. And he made some other arguments. He said this, quote, transportation is an evil which ought to be minimized. That is we should not allow, we should minimize transportation of goods from Europe to America, for example, or for that matter, from Pennsylvania to Maryland, or from Alabama to Tennessee. Should minimize transportation. And Abe Lincoln, decades later, would repeat the same thing about the evils of transportation cost. Okay, sounds very much like Douglas North, doesn't it? The transactions costs, economics, the evils of transactions costs. And he also made the argument that with high protectionist tariffs would cause lower prices somehow. That if you just protect them from foreign competition, they would compete among themselves, and that would drive prices down. So all these businesses that are supposedly lobbying for protectionism do so because they think they will be able to charge lower prices if they get protectionist tariffs. That's basically Hamilton's argument. And Abe Lincoln repeated the same thing. He also came out in favor of the idea that only things that cannot be grown or manufactured in the United States should be allowed to be imported to the United States. So if we can't grow coffee in North America, then we can import coffee. But if we can make shoes, there should be no shoe imports at all, zero imports at all. And once again, his political heir, Abe Lincoln, made the exact same argument for protectionist tariffs also. And so, believe it or not, this was sort of the original template, sort of theoretical template for protectionism of Hamiltonian mercantilism. And it was repeated over and over and over and over again. And so as far as the curses, so by the time you get to Jackson's day, there's an interesting story that I'll tell related to, Jackson vetoes the Bank of the United States, so that the Hamiltonians, the mercantilists are failing. They're not getting this. And so finally, Hamilton is long gone, and it was Henry Clay who picked up the mantle of mercantilism, which is why Trump went to Louisville, Kentucky to give his first economic speech and quoted Henry Clay. He praised Henry Clay literally to the treetops in Louisville, Kentucky. And so Clay was the man, and he's credited with inventing what was called the American system, although it was really Hamilton who used that phrase. And of course, it's really the British system, come to America is what it was. But they finally got their man. They finally elected my and Lou's favorite president, William Henry Harrison, right, Lou? That's you. who died 1 month after taking office. That's William Henry Harrison. He died, but he was a Whig, and Henry Clay and the Whig Party, their man was in the White House. They controlled Congress. They're finally going to get protectionist tariffs, internal improvement subsidies, and bring back the national bank. The vice president was John Tyler, who was a states' rights Jeffersonian. He vetoed everything. So they kicked John Tyler out of the Whig Party. They burned him in effigy in front of the White House. And Henry Clay threw the mother of all hissy fits over the whole thing. And it probably caused him to die 10 years earlier than he normally would have passed away from all this, because it was quite the calamity for them. But John Tyler saved the day. And that, by the way, has a lot to do with why there's a book called Recarving Rushmore that ranks American presidents by Ivan Eland, E-L-A-N-D. And unlike all the history professors who write books that rank presidents, their criteria are usually whoever taxes, spends, and borrows the most and gets the most people killed in wars. That's who's at the top. That's why Wilson, FDR, Lincoln are always at the top. But Ivan Eland's criterion is whoever does the best job at protecting constitutional liberty. And his number one president is John Tyler. He ranks John Tyler number one. That's why you've never heard of John Tyler. So he calls him the most libertarian of all presidents, Ivan Eland. He works for the Independent Institute in California, in Oakland, California, or at least he used to. I don't know if he's still there or not, but at the time the book was written, he was associated with David Thoreau's Independent Institute out there. And so anyway, that's what happened. So at the same time, you had, here's Jackson vetoing the Bank of the United States. Hold your applause, please. And then the Whigs thought they'd been making a comeback. They elected their man, and John Tyler comes in. And so, Andrew Jackson and John Tyler were huge heroes for those acts at that time of history, with each sort of about 10 years apart that this happened. And so, but they never give up. The sources of political greed and rent-seeking and plunder never give up. And so they moved to the states. State governments all over the United States, beginning in the 1830s, started using state tax dollars for road and canal building and some very minor railroad subsidies, but nothing, hardly, but road and canal building. And Abe Lincoln was the leader of the Whigs in the Illinois legislature. And they got them to allocate $11 million at the time, was huge, for road building, canal building, and nothing was finished in Illinois. Not one road was completed. So all the roads were roads to nowhere. They never completed, and all the canals were canals to nowhere, never completed. And this happened in state after state after state, and it created such a calamity that all the taxpayers were saddled with all this debt that they had to pay off, that by the time you get to 1860, the eve of the American Civil War, every state in the United States had amended its constitution to make it illegal to use tax dollars to a corporation to do anything. Only Massachusetts had not done so. By the time you get to 1860, Massachusetts was the only state to have not amended its constitution, not just pass a law, but amend his constitution and say that no state tax dollars can go to a corporation for road building or anything else. So they failed again. But another success they had temporarily was the Tariff of Abominations. There's another economic nationalism plank. In 1828, the Whigs managed to raise the average tariff rate to 48%. And South Carolina was the biggest opponents, and the South Carolinians had passed a nullification law that said we're not going to collect this. And this law actually allocated $160,000, the equivalent of $160,000 in 1832, early 1830s, for the governor of South Carolina to purchase firearms with which to fend off federal tax collectors. So there was almost a war, a war of secession in 1828 to 1832 that occurred there. They were serious. Part of this law also said that if any federal tax collectors showed up in South Carolina, that he would have all of his personal possessions and properties confiscated and he would be imprisoned. And so that was a bit of a deterrent, I would think, to taking the job of tax collector in South Carolina. And so they were serious. And Jackson, as I said, he was sort of schizophrenic on this. He threatened to send warships. He didn't. Lincoln did 30 years later, but he didn't. And so they negotiated. They ended up negotiating a lower tariff after that lowered the tariff after that period of time, so that by the time you get to 1860, the eve of the American Civil War, the average tariff rate in America was 15%, which is said to be the high watermark of free trade in that century, in the 19th century in America, as far as that goes. And so they failed again. They tried that version of it. Okay, but then Lincoln comes along, gets elected president, and all of this is voted into policy. He raised tariffs 10 times. The Civil War is over. The average tariff rate is in a 50% range, not 15%, and it stayed there until 1913 when the income tax came in. They began the massive subsidies of the railroad corporations. Finally, even though the states had these awful experiences, including Illinois, with subsidies, and they subsidized the railroads, and of course that led to the greatest political scandal in American history up to that point, the Credit Mobilier scandal, related to corruption of the government subsidized railroads, and so this is I'll show you how it was spelled. I'm not a French speaker, but I've heard people say this word. That was the name of a company. What they did, what these characters did, these politicians, is they were in charge of running the government subsidized transcontinental railroad project, building transcontinental railroads. And let me get this out of here. And they would set up companies that would say sell iron rails, and iron rails. Say you could buy an iron rail for $1 on the free market. They would use government money to pay themselves $100 for the same iron rail, and they would bribe members of Congress to go along with it by giving them shares of stock with the insider information that all of a sudden this company is going to be worth a fortune once we start paying ourselves $100 for an iron rail when you normally buy for 100. And this went on for years until finally there was some big argument between some of the conspirators, and one of them got so ticked off that he told a journalist. He spilled the beans to a journalist, so it all blew up, and the American Secretary of State was involved in it, and all. So it was a big, as the Jeffersonians always predicted, and also they built probably the worst built railroads in the world, the government subsidized railroads. I've drawn a map of what I think would be an example of the routes of the government subsidized railroads. There's a map of America, and the routes are kind of like that. And the reason they were kind of like that was that every member of Congress in that part of the country insisted, if you're gonna get my vote, you need to run a line to my district. Even if there's 2 people a year that ride the train, if you want my vote, there's going to be a line to mine. So that's what they did. And there was one man who did not do this. James J. Hill built the Great Northern Railroad, and with no subsidies, not even land grants. Of course, there were huge government land grants to the subsidized ones. And that's my map of James J. Hill's route. You could look these up on the web. You could look up the Great Northern Railroad route, and you can see it looks kind of like this. And then you could Google Union Pacific Railroad route, and it really does look something like that. It really does look something like that. And so they built, and these are all the kind of things that the Jeffersonians had been predicting. This is inevitable would happen if you go this way. So that was another curse of, as I call it, curse of economic nationalism in American history. And speaking of, I was on vacation in Montana a couple of years ago, and we went to northern Montana. I was in Yellowstone for a while. Then went 5 hours drive north of that, and we went into a small town. And I sat down. There was a restaurant that had sort of a second floor balcony. You could sit out there and have lunch. I went out there, and there's train tracks there. And parked in a train was a Great Northern Railroad train. And so this was just a couple of years ago, but this was the 1870s. It's still there. It's still operating, the Great Northern. It's James J. Hill's thing. I think the rumor has it that he was one of the main figures in the novel Atlas Shrugged that was modeled after James J. Hill. Well, anyway, fast forward, more economic nationalism, the New Deal. The New Deal, which was really started by Herbert Hoover. He didn't call it the New Deal. But in my book on capitalism, How Capitalism Saved America, I quote Rexford Tugwell, who was FDR's main economic policy advisor for 12 years, for the whole duration of the Roosevelt administration, as saying they really just took what Hoover was doing and expanded on it. They took basically the same ideas. They just went much further than the kind of things Hoover was doing. And of course, he signed off on the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which increased the average tariff rate up to almost just under 60%. It was like 59.6% was the average tariff rate. And keeping in mind that, it had gone from 15% back in the day to that. And that spawned an international tariff war that reduced the value of world trade by 2/3 in 3 years, the Smoot-Hawley tariff. So that was another curse that happened that came, let's talk about Hamilton's curse, another mercantilist curse. And then the first New Deal was Hamiltonian corporate welfare. It was the National Recovery Act imposed price floors on just about everything, all manufactured goods and all farm goods, all agricultural goods, price floors. And so they hired thousands of price control police to fine or even jail people for cutting prices, because they thought the Great Depression was caused by low prices. That was Roosevelt's theory of the cause of the Great Depression. So if we only get the government to force up prices, we'll end the Great Depression. It was their thinking, and I need not say more about that. And of course, that led to decades of crony capitalism. At the same era, the early 20th century, we had all the so-called natural monopolies created by government fiat, government franchise monopolies. And once they gave the electric power industry and the telephone industry natural monopoly, I always hated that word, natural. There's nothing natural about it. It's government created monopoly. Natural was the free market, was the opposite. The free market, it's kind of like jumbo shrimp, isn't it? Military intelligence. It's contradiction in terms. But once they gave these companies, these industries, monopoly status, everybody, the real estate industry, the dairy industry, everybody, well, I'm a natural monopoly too, and we want to eliminate competition. But that was economic nationalism. There are books written. There's a guy named Lind, who's an author, who's written a big book of essays on economic nationalism, but he's praising economic nationalism. He's a sort of a Pat Buchanan type on this. And he praises the FDR as the way to go. And of course, we know now that the so-called New Deal policies caused the Great Depression to be much longer and much deeper than it otherwise would have been, even the mainstream economics. Of course, the Austrians knew this all along, but one of my old articles in the Free Market, probably about 10 years ago now, I was surprised to see in the Journal of Political Economy, one of the big economics journals, that a couple of big shots, including the editor of the American Economic Review, had published an article on the JPE saying that the Great Depression actually made the New Deal actually made the Great Depression longer lasting and more severe. The same thing the Austrians had been saying for decades and decades. And Richard Vedder and Lowell Galloway said the same thing maybe 10 or 15 years before these guys did in their book, Out of Work, but they just ignored all that. And so maybe I'll stop there. That's my sort of talk about economic nationalism and why I think it's a curse. I hope you learned something about where it comes from, the ideas that guided it, and they're still alive today, where the President of the United States calls himself an economic nationalist. he doesn't know what it means really, but he still calls himself an economic nationalist. Someone told him Henry Clay was a neat guy, I guess, but so he does. And so I don't know. Do we have a few minutes for questions? If anybody has questions, comments, high praise, or anything like that, it's not required.
Other than the National Bank, were there a lot of Hamilton's protectionist ideas that were enacted right off the bat?
Protectionist ideas? I mean,
Yeah.
tariffs?
Yeah.
No, he succeeded with the National Bank. That was his big success in terms of economic policy. But everything else, James Madison, when he became president, Jefferson was president from 1800 to 1808 was his last year, and Hamilton was dead. He died in 1804. He was in a famous duel with Aaron Burr. And Gary North once told me that he once started an Aaron Burr society, and their logo was "Not soon enough." was, so he was dead. But Madison becomes president after Jefferson, and the very last thing he did was to veto an internal improvements bill. There was a bill that was supposedly a bill to give pensions to soldiers from the War of 1812 or something like that. And there was a rider in it that would have provided a small amount of money even at the time for road building. And Madison said, this is not, you'll have to amend the Constitution before you did that. And president after president vetoed until the Civil War, Andrew Jackson vetoed internal improvement subsidies, and John Quincy Adams said the greatest defeat of his presidency was he didn't get these passed, and he blamed John C. Calhoun. He called him the evil genius of the South because he was against this sort of thing. Because there was a tension, Southerners and they didn't want to pay taxes to have a railroad built in the North, and vice versa. Northerners didn't want to pay taxes if the route was to be in the South. So there was a big controversy over that. But they didn't get any of that stuff. They 1824, they got a tariff increase, and that encouraged them to go further and pass the Tariff of Abominations 4 years later. But that was long after Hamilton's day was over. But the bank was his big thing. They didn't get any internal improvements. Jefferson's Treasury Secretary was in favor of internal improvement subsidies, but Jefferson told him we would have to amend the Constitution first. So the strict constructionists were serious strict constructionists in those days about the Constitution. And he didn't say we shouldn't have internal improvements. He said you have to amend the Constitution first if you want them. But then Hamilton died, but his heirs, John Marshall was the Chief Justice was his real powerful political descendant. And he promoted Hamilton's view. He's the one. Hamilton also invented the idea that the states, I don't know if he invented it, but he popularized the idea that the states were never sovereign. They never really delegated powers to the government. It was the other way around. The federal government is sovereign. And John Marshall did a great deal as Chief Justice for 36 years to repeat that over and over again, to sort of lay the groundwork for when Abe Lincoln came along to repeat the same lie that the states didn't ratify the Constitution. The late Joe Sobran said that made as much sense that the Union created the states makes as much sense as saying a marital union can be older than either spouse. How can that be? So anyway, so that's the answer to your question. Long-winded answer to your question. Any other questions or comments? Thank you for not snoring while I was talking. That was the first time in several days. So, and that'll be it for today. You're free to go.